Hi there. In this tutorial I thought I'd revisit lights as they apply to the Cycles render engine. So there's obviously a lot of difference between Cycles and Eevee, and Eevee is the render engine of choice if you're going to do animation and things like that, simply because it's a simplified render engine and can therefore often give you faster render times, and render times are critical when you've got to render a lot of frames. That said, Cycles is perfectly suitable for animation as well. It's just that you're going to have to probably take a hit on render times to a degree. But with Blender 3, those render times have been reduced quite a bit, and it takes advantage of a lot of the new functions available within the latest graphics cards. So it's becoming more and more powerful. Cycles, unlike Eevee, is a true physically based render engine, so it will illuminate a scene and render a scene that will look very much as you would imagine it would look if you'd created the same thing in real life. And I'll talk a little bit about how that actually works. But to begin with, let's just get into some of the ideas of what options there are for lighting within Blender. So to begin with, I'm just going to create a plane. We'll go into edit mode and we'll just subdivide that. And then I'm just going to select two sides, extrude them upward like that. So we've got a sort of partial box. I'll give it a basic material and we'll just leave it at sort of a mid-white. I'm now going to add a lamp into the scene, which for the moment we're just going to make a point light. So I'll talk about the different types of lights as well. So I'm just lifting that up a bit. I'll go to the background and we'll set that to a simple black. So I'm now going to go into rendered view up here. So this is a sort of preview version of rendering, but in Cycles it's pretty close to what you'll actually get during the render. And as you might expect, we've got our box and we've got our simple illumination. Something worth noting is that, as you would expect with a physically based render engine, you can actually see these corners here. So essentially there is differences in the amount of light a surface is reflecting based on the angle that it is relative to that surface. And that's why you can see these corners. And ambient occlusion is a term that relates to that as well. Ambient occlusion is where ambient light isn't completely able to reach a surface in some parts, and therefore you get a sort of soft shadow in that area. Now, we don't actually have ambient light in this scene, but what we do have is reflected light that is reflecting off these surfaces. So as well as the direct light coming from this point light source here, in our imagination it's hitting these surfaces and then bouncing off and illuminating other surfaces. So a non-physically based render engine either wouldn't do that, or it would approximate and estimate what that would look like. So you might have less realistic presentations of corners and edges like this. So let's just have a quick play with some of the settings for that initial, most basic of lights, the point light. Obviously you can play around with the color as you would expect, and the power. So the power is in watts. So this is quite a dim light at the moment. If I put that up to a kilowatt, that's sort of outside illumination light, and you can see it's all completely washed out. We can barely see any detail in the scene at all, and that's because we've got a pretty much white surface. And if I put it down to 1 watt, it's a much more interesting scene, but you can see it's only barely illuminated. Let's put that up to 20 watts. Maybe that's a bit too much actually. We'll go to 15 watts. And then we can talk about the radius. So if I now drop this lamp, I'm going to bring it close to the surface. I'm just going to move that 3D cursor away so we can see where it's brightest just around the lamp. If I go below the surface, obviously we start to get a shadow. If I turn the radius all the way down, you can see that really is an impossibly point light source. It almost seems brighter. And now if I turn that size up, and you can see you've got a guide as to how big the lamp is here. I think this wall is 1 meter across, and it's now 0.8 meters for the size of the overall lamp. And you can see it seems to get dimmer. And this is a theme about lamps. It's still 15 watts, but it's spread over a bigger area, so it sort of is a dimmer lamp. And when we go on to some other kinds of lights, that'll become more obvious. And that's a sort of consistent property that you would expect with a realistic lamp. So we'll go back down to 0.2. Max bounces, I'm not going to worry too much about. That's less about the light itself and more about the rendering element. But essentially, if I put this down to 1, you can see there isn't a huge difference. It starts to make a bit of a difference when I put it down to 0. It's basically trying to say, don't bounce the light around. The only light we've got illuminating this scene now is light that comes directly from this lamp. We haven't got any light bouncing off this wall and illuminating this one over here. As soon as I go up to 1, however, now we have, and then there isn't a huge amount of difference as we go up. Although with a more complex scene, particularly with caustics and things like that and reflections, more bounces will often improve things, and certainly when you're using volumetrics it will. So we can go right up to a silly number, and that obviously makes Blender work a lot harder because it's having to work out many more bounces. Reality is, this is such a simple scene that there aren't any light beams that are bouncing more than 3 or 4 times probably. Put that down to a reasonable number. Obviously we've got casting shadows, so if I now add an object into the scene, you can see that's, as you might expect, casting a shadow. I'm just going to put it slightly through the floor, and we can see it's a very diffuse shadow at the moment. So I select my point light again. By making the radius down at 0, now we get a very sharp shadow. Again, this is an effect you would expect from real life. So if you had a very small lamp, you'll get much sharper shadows than if you have a very large one. This will often relate, for example, when you're simulating outside lighting and you're trying to vary between whether you have an overcast day, which means a very diffuse light source, the sun's behind clouds, or a very bright cloudless day where you've got the sun shining directly on the scene, and then you'll want a smaller light source, or you want to simulate as if you had a smaller light source, smaller point light source, in order to give you more direct shadows. But the same is true for any lamp. The bigger it is relative to the objects it's illuminating, the less well defined the shadows will be, because you've got more opportunities for both direct and reflected light rays to illuminate what would otherwise be the shadow. So a little bit about just quickly how light works in a physically based renderer. We obviously think in terms of light coming from the light source, hitting this side of the cube, for example, and then coming directly toward the camera and showing us that that part of the scene is illuminated. And that's obviously what happens in real life. However, the problem with that is that there will be an awful lot of light rays that don't actually ever make it to the camera. A near infinite number, in fact, in real life. Even in Blender, if you said every light source emitted 1 million light rays, then perhaps only 10% of those, 100,000, might actually make it to the camera to be seen because they were reflected off a surface which was at just the right angle that they ended up going into the camera, or reflected off another surface, reflected again, and then finally made it back to the camera. So you've done all that work in working out that a light beam came over here, bounced off the ground, bounced off there, and then flew off into infinity. You've done all that calculation to work that out for no effect on the scene that you can see. So rather than wasting all that calculation power on working out where light rays would go that you'll never see, and working out which light rays you will see and which you won't, the physically based renderer reverses the sense. So what it does is it treats the camera almost as if it's a light, and it then shoots beams out of the camera in the mathematical sense. They bounce around the scene, and if they end up hitting a light, then that little beam is counted as a light ray that would have made it back to the camera. So light reflects the same way back to the light as it does to the light. So in other words, light reflecting off the side of this cube could effectively be seen as a beam that's come directly from the center of this display, which is the camera at the moment, hit that cube, and then bounced at just the right angle that it's ended up hitting within 0.16 of a meter the center of that light. And as soon as Blender detects that it's hit a light, it marks that as a beam that it needs to keep, a ray that it needs to keep, and therefore was a successful light ray. And then it keeps doing that. The other element is, of course, I'm going to just briefly touch on this. There is a lot of noise in the scene, and this is an artifact of how physically based render engines work, because there's no way to do all of the light. Even if you were going to say for every small part I'm going to do 1,000 light beams, you can't do it all and then move on to the next bit and then move on to the next bit, because there are interactions between each element of the scene. So there is light, for example, hitting this wall, hitting the back of this cube. I'm obviously going back the other way again now, and then coming out and hitting this wall again, so the lightening any shadow that might be here, and then finally making it back to the camera. Or in reality, of course, all of that's working in reverse. So you need to be able to make a sort of approximation of the whole scene and then do it again as you refine that approximation. And that's all done by randomly choosing rays to calculate across the scene. And that's what you'll see with cycles. As I move around, for example, you can see it's having another go and having another go, and over time the scene gets better and better. And they've improved this quite a bit with Blender 3. What I used to do with older versions of Blender for cycle scenes was I would put the number of samples up to a high number, I think I used something like 4000, it may even have been higher than that. And then it would just continuously carry on rendering the viewport, getting better and better with time, which it's doing now, but beyond a certain point, there's sort of diminishing returns. And so you would do other things to improve it. So while we're at this point, I may as well talk about some of the additional settings for light within Cycles. So we're in the scene settings. If you can, make sure you're using GPU compute just because it will be quicker, but if your GPU doesn't support that, which is CUDA, so just quickly under preferences, under system, make sure you've got your graphics card enabled. You can also use the CPU simultaneously, and in theory allows those two things to work in tandem and gives you another speed boost. I haven't tested it out on Blender 3. In earlier versions of Blender I found that actually slowed things down, so I generally just work with the GPU where I can. There are other options as well if you've got compatible graphics cards for those. And once you've enabled it there, you can turn it on here. If you want to do other things with your computer while it's doing it, you can change it to CPU and then reduce the number of cores that it's using rather than all of them, so you can go and do other tasks while you're rendering. But obviously it will be slower as it's not a dedicated graphics processor. So that was a bit of a tangent there, not really about lighting. We've got a couple of options here, which is to do with viewport rendering. It's much tidier and easier to use now, so not going to worry too much about that. But again, the max samples is how many times, if you like, it will go around the scene to improve it, to again reapproximate what color, what brightness a particular pixel should be. And for the viewport it's currently set to 1024. For the render engine, it's for proper renders, it's set to 4096. And then we've got denoising, which I'm not going to go into at the moment. Little note about the impact of having a certain amount of noise in your scene. Even if you denoise it, it's still there to some extent. If you're creating an animation, you need to turn this little clock on just by clicking it. And what that does, it randomly decides what spot to do the calculations for to work out whether any light reached the camera, and it does that all the way across the scene. So it's randomly picking spots, which is why some are brighter than others and we're getting noise in the scene. And the random that it uses is obviously a computer generated random, which uses a seed to use a table and probably the time in the computer and a few other things, create a pseudo random number. Where it starts on that calculation is set by the seed, and if every frame while everything's moving around is using the same seed, then effectively whatever the random pattern is will stay consistent even with things moving around. So it will look a bit like there's a screen, sort of dotty screen in front of all the action that's going on, which for a still image isn't a big issue, but for an animated image it can be a bit distracting, looks a little odd. So you can change that by clicking this, and it will then apply the frame number to the seed. And what all that really means is it's using a different seed for every frame, so the random pattern will be different for every frame. And if you imagine on a typical animation you've got at least 25 frames per second, then that pattern of dots is changing 25 times a second. So while you may be able to see there's this faint flickering pattern on there, hopefully it'll be a lot less distracting. And obviously you're going to work to minimize that noise, and perhaps I'll do a video on minimizing noise in Cycles renders as well. So then we come down to light bounces. If you don't change anything here, then it's either set by the light itself or it's set by just the number of samples you're going to run. So one of the things we're most interested in is light paths. And I'm going to add a couple more objects into the scene just to talk about how they differ. So we'll just come out of the rendered view. We'll add a cylinder. I'm leaving them embedded in the floor intentionally. And we'll add an icosphere, but I'll put a subdivision surface on it. And we'll say shade smooth. I'm going to move my lamp over here a bit. Okay, I'm going to open another window up at this point, and we'll just put some materials on these objects now. We'll call this one glass, so I'm going to remove that shader. This isn't necessarily the best shader for representing glass, but it's just one that's in there, so easy to use. While I'm in here, I'm just going to create a new material, which is going to be a metallic material, which has got no roughness on it. It's not actually applied to anything yet. And we'll just call this one red, and we'll make that a diffuse material with a bit of shininess on it without being completely reflective. And perhaps we'll make a copy of that, make it unique, and call that blue, and obviously make it blue. So we'll come back to the rendered view, and you can see we've got our glass material, and you may notice it's actually a little bit slower to render now because it's having to work quite hard with this material. So I'm just going to add some of those other materials in here. Got to name that one, but that's our mirror material. There's our red material, and we'll put a cone in, something like that, and we'll give that our blue material. Turn that off there, and we'll say shade smooth on that one as well. So I'm going to turn our light up a bit now, and we can start to see some new artifacts. So the first thing I point out is, although we can't see the lamp directly here, for this type of lamp, which is a pure lamp, it actually is showing up in here, at least in the viewport. Something to be aware of. If I play with the size of it, you can see it's changing there. I think traditionally it didn't used to do that in Cycles. It does in EV, but it didn't used to do it in Cycles. But clearly there's some slight changes there. Not a big problem if you don't want it to show up in mirror objects or reflective objects. We can come down here and we can select glossy off like that. But obviously it may have some other knock-on effects to our scene. There's something to bear in mind. So I'm just lifting it up now so we've got a bit more light bouncing around our scene, and we'll make it smaller again. I'm going to add another mesh object. In fact, I'm just going to make it plain. I'm going to give it the brown material, which is basically a white material. I'm just going to put it there and then go back into rendered view. So maybe the light's a little bright at the moment, so I'll scale it down a little bit. What you should be able to just make out is that we've got some colour bleeding onto this paper, as it were. It's not showing up that well at the moment. Probably would show up more in the rendered view. So let's just put my camera and then we'll give that a quick render. So you can just about see it. I'm not sure it's any better, but you can just about make out that there is some colour, not just white light, that is reflecting off this object and showing up on this paper. It's not showing up very strongly actually, but it is there. Perhaps if I make the material more diffuse by increasing roughness here. So that's one of the things that you do get with Cycles, and that is irradiance, which is basically the idea that light rays can be coloured by the surface off which they've reflected, bearing in mind in reality everything's actually happening in reverse. Another thing of note, we just move this out the way. You can see it a lot better there as I got really close, and you can see the blue there. Actually there's some blue light showing up on the edge of that paper there because it's getting close to this. So if we look at our glass cube here, you can see we're getting multiple reflections in there, and you notice partly because I've zoomed in on it, the viewport sampling is going quite a bit more slowly because it's having to do a lot more work. There's a lot of reflections going on here and a certain amount of refraction as well. I'm interested in the wall behind that object. I'm going to turn the point light up again now. So you can see we've got some shadows there, and I think I'm going to move these aside as well just to make sure I'm getting plenty of light in. And we've got something that's contributing to the scene called caustics. The caustics can be from reflections or refractions, and they're all about the refractive effects of reflective and transmissive surfaces. It's hard to tell with just a cube, so I'll make that shape a little more complicated. I'll add some additional geometry into it, and then I think we'll just select some faces and we'll see what that's done. So you can see we've got even more things going on inside here now in terms of reflections. So if we come back to here and we scroll down to light bounces, this is an attempt to manage the amount of bounces and refractions and reflections that we have to make render times reasonable. But very often for specific effects, you may want to increase the number of bounces, so that's light rays bouncing around, that you are going to allow. This is commonly the case when you're going to use volumetrics, because the default is very low. You'll still get some bounces, enough to see the volumetric effect like smoke and so on, but you can often improve the amount of light that reaches the camera that's bounced around in that volumetric effect by increasing this number. So what have we got with this cube? We've got transmitted light and reflected and probably refracted light as well. So transmission might benefit from increasing. So let's put that up to 48. I think we are getting slightly more light through there now. We've also got transparent, so that's obviously directly related to transparent materials. So let's go for 24, that one. We've also got shiny surfaces here, so glossy might benefit. Let's put that up to 16. So although we're not getting any obvious caustic dots and bright spots here, I need to play around with the position of the light and the shape that I'm putting it through. You'll tend to get them more with more curvy sort of objects than this angular one. If I put a subdivision surface on it, it might help. But the other thing is that you're paying a price for that, and the price is that more bounces are necessary in order to approximate. Now, we actually do have some caustics here now, because you can see there's a fairly dark edge to the shadow, and then it's actually lighter in the middle, and that's a caustic. It's a fairly subtle one, but it is a caustic. And I can prove that by, if I turn off refractive caustics, watch what happens. Our shadow gets much darker. It's still a perfectly reasonable shadow, and you wouldn't necessarily notice, except for the fact when, as I say, we're not getting any caustics, and there are times when you specifically do want them. However, there are often times when you don't. So unless you've got some fairly significant transparent, reflective and refractive objects in your scene, so I don't mean just the sort of reflections you get off a slightly shiny object like this, but I mean very curvy objects like this, or very glass-like objects such as this one. Unless you have those as significant elements in your scene, you usually don't need refractive caustics, or for that matter, reflective caustics in your scene. So you can turn them off and the scene will render more quickly, meaning you have either a less noisy scene or you reach an acceptable level of noise more quickly, and in the vast majority of cases with no detectable impact on the end quality of the scene. However, a scene like this, where these are more significant to the scene, you probably do want them. And it just means that you have to pay the price in terms of the time to render and so on. So what does this do? This is a relatively new addition. Fast GI approximation is global illumination. So this is sort of going a little way toward making cycles work a bit more like a non-physically based render engine. So if I click this, you can see we've lost all of our reflective and refractive caustic. We've got a scene which renders much more quickly, but it's still a cycle scene. So you can still see there is a certain amount of noise back there. You can see up here the samples shooting up to 1000, it's done. If I turn that off, you can see the samples are going up much more slowly now. So it may be something you just want to use just to get a quick idea of what the scene illumination is looking like, perhaps when you're setting the lights up, or it may be perfectly acceptable to use that anyway. And there are settings within here. You can see this one just replaces the scene with this fast approximation, and you notice we've got viewport bounces of 1 there. If I set those down to 0, I think 0 effectively disables it, so it just goes back to normal. But you could go up to 10. It'll try much harder to give the effects that we want, but will also be relatively slow. But you can see there's not a vast difference between that and this. Arguably this is the higher quality scene because it's going to do 1000 samples at all these various different levels in terms of bounces. So the summary of all that is only have these turned on if you really feel you need them. I mean, you can try turning them on and off, but it will generally reduce the amount of noise in your scene and also make it render a lot faster if you turn them off. You can see how quickly that's going up now. So that's 1000 samples, which is pretty impressive. Obviously, you can still use denoising and things like that. I'll just quickly turn the viewport denoise on there, and you can see it's sort of almost a cartoon of the scene that it was at first. It will generally do some successive improvement of that as it does more samples. And if I turn reflective and refractive caustics back on, you can see that cube particularly lightens up quite a lot. But there is always a price to pay. You can't really use denoising very effectively, or not simply anyway, with volumetrics. And now you can actually make out the caustics a little better because you can see there's a sort of light spot there, there's some dark spots around here, you can see a lighter spot in here. But I have found caustics don't always render that well when you're using denoising, and the odds are you're going to use denoising to some degree in order to be able to render your scene, even if it's a single frame, in a reasonable amount of time. And when I say reasonable, I mean an hour or two rather than several days, but it depends on the scene. So I think I will stop that tutorial there. The next tutorial, I'll go into different light sources. So I talked about a lot of the settings with this one, but I'll talk about the different types of lights there are and how you can use them, and maybe some ideas of basic light setup that you may want to use in your scene. I will make available any of the source files that I think might be of some use to my Patreon, so if you're interested in that, go and take a look at that. There's a link below. If there's anything you particularly want me to cover that I haven't yet covered, either in this set of tutorials or in others, please leave a comment below. If you've got some useful hints and tips, either for me or any of the other viewers, again, put a comment below, and don't forget to click like and subscribe. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.